Hello everyone, my name is Thoman. A friend asked me to tell a story, actually a video story of how I met my wife Carol. I thought, I've got a story that I've been telling for 35 years and I kind of like the story. And it shouldn't be too boring for a friendly audience, so why not give it a try? You should know this is not a real story of how we met, but a tale of how our paths crossed and how the eventual conclusion came about, how I got my wishes filled. So it goes like this. Let me set the stage. It was early spring in 1987, and I was in my last semester of dental school. I'd graduate in a few months, and along with most of my classmates, I was very happy to be finishing and only a little anxious to begin the new phase of my life. I knew I would finally need to get a real job, and I expected it would turn into a career and probably a profession, and if I were lucky, eventually into a calling. Settling down was on my mind, but only a little bit. Although there had been some serious, semi-serious relationships over the previous years, nobody had really caught my attention enough to say, hey, this girl is the one. And many of you listening probably know what I mean. Recently, though, I'd been gathering a list of talents and characteristics of that right one, the right woman, that made sense to me just in case the right one did show up. It was the normal stuff, I guess. Intelligence, attractive, important to have a sense of humor, and extremely tolerant. Past relationships had taught me that tolerance was going to be really important. I'd say that there are probably 8, maybe 10 items on the list. And although I'd been married before to a wonderful young woman, that choice was made with a poorly developed 18-year-old brain that was about to go off to the army. I really wasn't thinking with my brain, if you know what I mean. Anyway, on to the story. The real love of my life. It starts with a high school friend, Rick. He had given my phone number to Carol. Rick was a few years ahead of me in dental school, and Carol was a year behind me. Now, Rick had been to my house many times over the previous 4 years, and he knew that I was moving to a different home. A simple shaker house I planned on buying on the south side. The house I was leaving, though, was a fantastic place. In fact, Carol had been there a couple of times for different events or parties that I had posted. This was a great summer party house. You see, this house that I was renting was a gardener shack on a much larger 30-acre property that sat on sacred burial ground at Eagle Creek Reservoir. I know, kind of strange, huh? If you don't know, Eagle Creek Reservoir is a medium-sized lake that sits within the largest city park in the country. That was really sort of a mystical place. It even came with a sailboat that I used whenever I wanted. It was magic. In the woods, on a hill, overlooking the water. It was sweet. Now, since I was a senior and likely to move on from my student housing, many of my fellow classmates had begun asking how they might become the next tenant. Rick knew that Carol had 2 years left in school, was really hoping to get away from student housing and find another place. He told Carol about the anticipated vacancy, and that's how she ended up with my phone number. By the time she finally tracked me down, I had to explain that her chances were really slim. There were probably 8 or 9 fellow students on the list who had already expressed an interest. Many of us had housing commitments that were about to end in 4 or 5 months, but I promised to let her know if things changed, but not to count on it. Fast forward a few months, some of those candidates were moving on to post-grad programs in another city. Some had already signed a lease, and some were getting married. Anyway, I called Carol in April, explained the opportunity. She moved into the little cabin in a few weeks, and after I moved on to my place and purchased my dad's practice in Southport. After a month or 2 of initial resistance from Carol, she eventually succumbed to my charms, and we started dating that same summer. I got to visit my old place on the water where she was now living, and she visited me in the old farmhouse while I was remodeling it. As things between us warmed up, I brushed off the list I had saved and found that each and every talent or characteristic was easily checked off. During the following months, we enjoyed picnics at Symphony on the Prairie, training and competing in triathlons, sailing on the lake, snow skiing in the Rockies, and dining alone on weekends. She finally asked me to marry her on Sadie Hawkins Day, February 29th, and we were married a few months later outdoors in Garfield Park on July 2nd, 1988, the hottest day of that decade. We live in Southport. We practice together on the south side of Indianapolis. Carol remains my best friend and the love of my life, and she still checks off all the talent and characteristics that I had on my wish list 35 years ago.